Hello, good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Donald C. Stewart and I'm here joined in the studio tonight by my guest Linda Fabiani, who we'll get to meet and talk to later on. But first, the headlines. Ukraine update, and we are now in day 212. And the pro-Russian authorities in 4 regions of occupied Ukraine, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, have been conducting widely condemned referendums on whether the regions desire to be annexed by the Russian Federation. NATO has condemned the plans to hold referendums, describing them as Moscow's blatant attempts at territorial conquest, which have no legitimacy. Mikhailo Podolyak, advisor to the head of the office of Ukraine's president, described the votes as a propaganda show, saying there is no legal action called a referendum in the occupied territories. Ivan Fedorov, Ukraine's elected mayor of Melitopol, has said participation in a pseudo-referendum is the worst betrayal. Serhiy Haidai, Ukraine's governor of Luhansk, said that all those involved in running today's referendums will be punished. The government of the Kharkiv region, Ole Syniehubov, has said 436 bodies have been exhumed from a mass burial site in the eastern city of Izium. 30 of the bodies bore visible signs of torture. Thousands of men across Russia have been handed draft papers after the mobilization announcement. Among those called up since Putin's announcement on Wednesday were Russians detained while protesting against the mobilization, the independent OVD Info Protest Monitoring Group said. Long lines of vehicles continue to form, with some waits of over 24 hours at Russia's border crossings on the second full day of Vladimir Putin's military mobilization. The Kremlin has dismissed reports of an exodus of Russian men of fighting age as exaggerated. Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas told her nation overnight that power blackouts are possible if Russia kicks the Baltic states from the joint power grid. Many of the Ukrainians exchanged in the largest prisoner swap with Russia since the beginning of the invasion show signs of violent torture, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence said on Thursday. 5 UK citizens released from Russia are meeting their families after several months of captivity in which it was feared they would be executed for fighting for Ukraine. At home, the Chancellor has cut taxes in a mini-budget. As widely trailed, Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng has announced a raft of tax cuts as part of what he said was a growth plan which would tackle energy costs and bring down inflation by backing business and helping households. As well as cancelling the national insurance increases, which were announced yesterday, the measures announced in the mini-budget include cancelling a planned corporation tax rise, keeping it at the current rate of 19%, lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses, cutting the basic rate of income tax to 19% in April 2023, affecting people in England, Wales and Northern Ireland 1 year earlier than announced previously by Rishi Sunak, scrapping the 45% additional rate income tax band for those earning more than £150,000 for people in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, cutting stamp duty in all levels of the property market in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Critics have said that the Chancellor's mini-budget will deepen inequality by robbing the poor to pay the rich. The Scottish Government has said that the Chancellor's measures fail to target support. In a statement, Deputy First Minister John Swinney said that the Chancellor's fiscal statement and package of announcements targets the most wealthy, shifting further pressure onto the shoulders of those on the lowest incomes. Reacting to the statement, Mr Swinney expressed his disappointment that while many households across Scotland are already struggling to pay their bills and heat their homes, the measures offer tax cuts for corporations and bankers. The Deputy First Minister was quoted as saying, "The Chancellor's statement today will provide cold comfort to the millions of people across Scotland who have been looking for the UK Government to use their reserved powers to provide support for those that need it most. Instead, we get tax cuts for the rich and nothing for those who need it most. We estimate that the increase in the price cap to £2,500 will force an estimated 150,000 more Scottish households into extreme fuel poverty. Instead of offering these people support, the Chancellor is threatening to cut their family budgets further with a new regime of benefit sanctions. Because of inflation, the Scottish Government's budget is worth £1.7 billion less than it was when we set it in December, yet the Chancellor has refused to provide a single additional penny for public services or increased public sector pay. Linda, if I can turn to you, that's clearly a huge raft of measures which the Chancellor has announced today. I can tell by your reaction that there's perhaps some of them that it's a degree of disappointment that for us over the border.
Oh, disappointment perhaps, but no, I'm not surprised, I have to say, Donald. What I'm surprised is that they called it a mini budget. And when it keeps getting referred to as a mini budget, it's pretty major. It's huge. I was listening to commentators today talking about it, and it's the biggest package of tax cuts since 1972. That's 50 years. Mm-hmm. And I vaguely remember that, I have to say. But from what I've read and what I've heard, that was a pretty disastrous budget in its time. So do the current Tory regime think that times have changed? Do they really believe that this is going to create this wonderful growth package? I don't believe it will. I'm certainly not an economist or an expert, but there's certain people on both sides of the argument that I read to form my own opinions. The best I can see is a short-term measure. It may in the short term. And I'll tell you, that then makes me think, are they doing this crash and burn thing? Do they know that they're taking a chance that they might have a short-term glow that would help them through the next election? But see if they don't. If they've accepted that they're going to get hammered at the next election, seems to me they're helping their pals,
Well, it's interesting. You referred back to the budget way back in the 1970s, and of course there is a movement within the Conservative Party to see Liz Truss as a natural successor to somebody who would have been in that cabinet in the 1970s, though not head of the government at the time, Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
Does it begin to feel a little bit more like we're getting the knee-jerk Thatcher without the long-term vision?
Yeah. It's an interesting one. I mean, I do think Liz Truss has been channeling Thatcher for some time. It seems very clear. But I think there's a difference. Even for those of us who detested Margaret Thatcher and what she stood for and what she did, what could never be denied about that woman was that she believed in what she was doing. She had a vision that most of us in Scotland felt was the wrong vision to have. But she believed in something. I don't think this lot that are there now have any principles. I don't think they believe in anything. It's all about short-term gain. It's all about looking after their own. I mean, they've brought this budget to the UK Parliament without any independent analysis, without any scrutiny from the Office of Budget Responsibility. And I keep thinking to myself, see if the Scottish Government did that in Holyrood. The Scottish Tories would be jumping up and down and going nuts, and the mainstream media would be backing them. Why do they get away so much? With so much down south? Is it because everyone is just so used to the lies, the cheating, just the absolutely ridiculous way of behaving, bypassing their own parliament, that nobody comments on these things anymore? And I think it's a real worry, both in terms of the economy and where is this levelling up going?
Well, it's interesting, of course, the major thrust of the previous, we call it previous government, of course, it's a continuation of a government, it's merely a change of the leader-in-chief, as it were, that there was to be this levelling up, some kind of equality across the board, certainly within England. Is the lack of scrutiny down to the fact that there isn't a credible opposition, perhaps, within England in the way that perhaps there is within Scotland?
I think there's an element of that in the UK Parliament, because I'm actually quite sad that the Labour Party, have not been a viable opposition. It just seems to me they cave in all the time. I mean, occasionally you get people who come out with some really good stuff. Emily Thornberry, for example, over the last couple of days has been doing sterling work on some of the excesses on the expenditure of the Foreign Office. Not so much in financial terms, but about what ministers get away with and sanction. So you get the occasional individual who comes out with good stuff, but as an opposition, the Labour Party have been appalling for years. So not only do we have a government that's been there for, 12 years now, who pretend they're a new government, but it's the same old players who've been part of all the decision-making over, the last years. You've also got an opposition which is stagnant. The SNP down there, I believe, is a more viable opposition, but because of the numbers and because they're deemed to just represent Scotland, they don't get the credit they're due for holding the UK government to account, because Labour's the chief opposition, and sadly they're pretty useless.
Is there any sense? I mean, I know that we had a resurgence of Greens. We had perhaps the Liberal Democrats seeing the shoots of recovery coming from after being in coalition with the Conservatives. They clearly suffered electorally. Is one of the things that I'd heard mentioned was that Liz Truss seemed to be more of a Joe Swinson than a Margaret Thatcher. Is the Liberal Democrat Party at a point where they might have an opportunity to be the real third way, or has that all gone by?
Well, I think Liz Truss certainly has a bit of the Joe Swinson in her, in reality, but she's got the aspirations of Margaret Thatcher. The Lib Dems resurgence, I'm not seeing it, I have to say. I mean, I would love to see more Green input in the UK Parliament, because I think Caroline Lucas is an absolute star. But it just doesn't appear to be there. Lib Dems, I find it hard to remember the name of the Lib Dem leader. Now, I know it's Sir Ed Davey, because I heard it on the radio on the way in. If I hadn't heard that article, I'd have been hard pushed to remember what the man's called. So no, I don't think there's any real surge of popularity with the Lib Dems.
What does it say in terms of our democracy that we're looking at what potentially could be a government who in 2 years' time are going to face the population in terms of looking to be re-elected? Liz Truss saying that she's happy to take the unpopularity just now because she believes that there's long-term gain. If they don't have any credible opposition to the government presenting their policies, where do people who are unhappy with the government go? Well,
one of the very, very sad things about the behaviour of the Conservative government over the last years is that they have eroded democracy. What they've also done is a very dangerous thing for democracy, which is they've sickened people. And they've played on that as well. I mean, changing the eligibility for voting and all that, wanting voter ID and everything. I think lethargy is going to be a big thing. Everybody for years has been talking about the importance of making sure that the franchise is used and that we get voting up. The Tories don't care about that at all. Absolute and utter nonsense. They don't care. It suits them if it's people who support them who are more likely to come out to vote than those that they've just battered down. And they are battering people down. And this budget is battering the poorest people down, the people who just eventually say, what's the point? What's the point? And it's very, very sad.
And yet, if I go back to the where we began tonight's bulletin with news of plebiscites and referenda within the eastern regions of Ukraine, the way in which both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss have made a great deal of play out of their support for democracy in Ukraine, it would appear that Conservatives could reasonably or unreasonably suggest that what they are currently doing is supporting democracy abroad because they can demonstrate how good it is at home.
Well, they support democracy everywhere. We talked about the Labour Party earlier. They're the same, and the Lib Dems, they're the same too. They support democracy everywhere except in their own doorstep, because they terrified of losing Scotland. you know, I've heard people say that David Cameron was a great guy because he gave the Section 30 of the referendum. He was then panicking because he thought we might win it. They're terrified to give another referendum, and they can rely on their cronies and the Labour Party, both elected and formerly elected, who will do their damnedest to make sure there's no referendum. And when it comes to perhaps a referendum, we'll see. If it comes to a plebiscite in a UK election, they will do their damnedest to make sure that the public in Scotland swallow the lies again and believe that this time a new Labour government, so excuse me using the term new Labour government, a new Labour government.
Important to have the commas.
Will do wonderful things. I think back to the vow in the run-up to the 2014 referendum, and it's been regurgitated now.
And the situation in Ukraine, we saw Liz Truss over at the United Nations.
Yeah.
We saw many speeches, many claims, many worries and concerns. We've obviously seen Putin order, or at least start to roll out the sort of enforced recruitment of people within Russia to join the armed forces, and the unfortunate suggestion that there may be a nuclear option in somebody's mind, if not on a table somewhere. It is worrying times, is it not, for Central Europe?
I think we're in really worrying times for the world. You know, I mean, obviously the situation in Ukraine is just horrendous. What Putin's doing is horrendous. Lots of other things happening around the world too that are bad. We've still got ongoing situations in Syria, the Yemen, for example. What's happening in Iran just now to women? It's just appalling. And on that same sliding scale of hammering women, look what's happening in a lot of the states in America just now as well, about the erosion of women's rights. I think the world is in a heck of a mess. And I've always got to be the optimist. I believe things can get better. I believe that, you know, people will get to the point where they will say enough's enough. But how much do people have to be battened down before it gets to that? And that's what I often think about Scotland in terms of independence. What does it take for us to say, no, we can do this better? You know what? We're pretty smart. And actually, we're pretty moral as well and ethical. And we're just not having this anymore.
Certainly within Europe, one of the major issues, not just in Ukraine, is again the resurgence of the far right. We see them joining the government in Sweden this weekend, I believe. There's more opportunity in Italy for them. There's Hungary, there's Poland. There's certainly a worry and a concern that whilst there are people who see equality and equity as very much part of their DNA, that they feel that there is a threat hanging over them electorally as well as principally.
Absolutely so. I mean, when I look at, you know, Italy and where it's heading at the moment, though Italy often surprises, you know, quite often in Italy, the commentators are proved very, very wrong at the end of the day. I hope that's the case this time too. And when you look at how many governments Italy has had since the end of the Second World War, for example, it's something like 70 or something. It's crazy stuff. But the rise of the right wing in Eastern Europe as well has been concerning, but there's some pulling back of that now. And I think in a strange sort of way, the ultimate right wing, which is Putin, you know, who that thing about you go so far to the right, so far to the left, and you end up meeting in the middle in a circle, is happening. I think he's really scared a lot of those round about him as well, who would have previously been seen perhaps as allies. It's a totalitarian thing rather than the right or left wing.
Well, the next part of tonight, obviously, in terms of the effect that the budget has had, and the SNP has come out and to say that the Chancellor is robbing the poor to pay the rich. The UK government is robbing the poor to pay the rich after the Chancellor announced that ordinary taxpayers will fool the bill for the energy company bailout and multi-billion-pound tax breaks for big business and high earners. Responding to the statement, Alison Thewlis MP said, measures announced do not go anywhere near far enough to help low and middle income families and small businesses, and will see the wealthiest benefit to the tune of billions at the expense of ordinary families. The SNP Shadow Chancellor said energy-rich Scotland is being forced to pay the price for years of failure at Westminster, and only independence can give Scotland the powers needed to maximise its energy potential and secure its supply. Commenting, SNP Shadow Chancellor continued that Scotland is an energy-rich country that shouldn't be facing a fuel poverty crisis, but yet again Scots are being forced to pay the price of Westminster failure. It's clearer than ever that Scotland needs the full powers of independence to realise our energy potential and keep families safe. The SNP have said that the measures announced today by the Chancellor don't go anywhere far enough in what they call the Tory-made cost of living crisis. Ms Thulis said that it was shameful that the UK government is increasing prices again to £2,500 instead of introducing a real freeze on energy bills. The Glasgow Central MP said the Tory Chancellor is a reverse Robin Hood, taking billions of pounds away from ordinary families, small businesses and our National Health Service and handing it over to the richest people and biggest businesses in the UK, adding, after a decade of Tory cuts and Brexit damage, the UK already had the worst poverty and inequality in North West Europe before energy bills began to rise. Now millions of families will be pushed further into hardship and saddened with billions in public debt. The UK government is demonstrating that independence is the only way to keep Scotland safe and build a fair, green and prosperous future. Now, Linda, that's quite a cutting statement. It's quite forthright. And is it right? Are we right to worry about the effect that a lot of these policies and the things that have been announced today in this mini budget, which you suggested was more of a maxi budget than a mini interruption economically, is likely to end up with more people suffering, and particularly those that are the most vulnerable?
Absolutely, I think it's beyond doubt. I did read a piece today by a think tank, which particular one I can't remember right now, but who said that in some households they're going to be charged 50% of their income for their energy costs. That's huge. It's absolutely huge. And how any government that is supposed to be charged with looking after the populace can think that's acceptable, I do not know, but it's quite clear that's what's happening. Other countries in Europe are looking to the energy companies and their shareholders to be the ones that take the hit. UK isn't. They're bailing them out every turn. Again, I was listening to a report today about the situation in Norway. And Norway is actually benefiting from the energy crisis because of their sovereign wealth fund and the way that the state of Norway has husbanded the resources of their oil and gas. So every citizen in Norway potentially benefits from the sovereign wealth fund that was set up when oil was discovered. So here we are in Scotland, potentially a resource-rich nation over these decades, the potential of which was blatantly hidden from the Scottish people by successive UK governments. And not only are we in a situation where some of our rural communities are paying big bucks to even get in the national grid, but here we are with ordinary people paying for this, and the government that is charged with looking after them and has the responsibility not giving a toss, and looking at cutting welfare benefits as well for those that are the least well off.
I suppose that is something that really does cut to the edge of it, the idea of the most vulnerable facing the possibility of further sanction, whilst bankers' bonuses are being allowed to go to whatever level that they would see as being required to retain the services of one, when perhaps we are cutting the opportunities for many. And I suppose that idea, you went back, you said earlier on, looking after your pals, looking after those who you believe are going to ensure that you continue to be in power through whatever means that may be necessary, that there is a groundswell of opinion that's beginning to build that the unfairness should lead to some form of I remember that there was the possibility of people refusing to pay gas and electricity bills, almost like a poll tax, where they are trying to effect change. Do you think that that time is ripe for some form of movement to?
Oh, do you know, I would never recommend to anybody who's hard up that they refuse to pay something or make an arrangement for payment, because sometimes that's a possibility, because there would be such a responsibility for me on anybody recommending that about the outcome for people. And I remember, you mentioned back to the can pay, won't pay poll tax stuff, and I remember it well, because I was in the fortunate position that I could afford not to pay. But not everyone is. And the idea of putting people in further hardship, because I'd put nothing past this lot that are there about how they would sanction people for not making an effort to pay. Put nothing past them, because they're eroding everything. They're eroding human rights as well. All the stuff that's going on in the background underneath this ridiculous leadership contest that the Tories had. The chaos government that Boris Johnson ran, something ridiculous always happened the day that something really serious was happening in the background. And that will carry on. So I would love to think there could be mass mobilisation. Of course I would. But you can't put people in that position when times are so hard.
What do you think is likely to happen with the Scottish Conservatives? Because they clearly have got the opportunity to lead some kind of, if you like, and they certainly Douglas Ross during the leadership campaign at one point made himself unpopular, popular, call it what you will, in terms of having something to say about Boris Johnson's leadership, and then it seemed to disappear when the Ukraine crisis came along. Do the Scottish Conservatives have a means or a mechanism through they have the ability of leading those within the Conservative Party or within the population generally who would normally vote for them in attempting not to sell these policies onto them, but recognising the mood of a particular nation and saying, actually, we think this might go too far?
I would love to think that would happen. They've been pretty invisible of late, the Scottish Conservatives. But it's not just them. It's their better together partners as well. Labour and the Lib Dems in Scotland, all these branch offices of the UK parties. They're far more interested in hammering the Scottish Government than they are in hammering the Tories at Westminster, sadly. And I would like nothing more than, I don't think the Tories would ever do it, because I don't give them enough thought in anything really. But I would love to think that the UK Labour Party in Scotland that call themselves Scottish Labour, I would love to think that they would stand up and go, no, enough's enough. We're not having it. There has to be big changes here. Mr Starmer going to start really doing something in opposition. And by the way, we're actually starting to look at Scotland properly and starting to think about what would be best for Scotland instead of just thinking about what would be best for our electoral success at Westminster. I would love that to happen, I really would. And the Lib Dems as well. I know there's only 3 or 4 of them, I don't know how many there are now in the Scottish Parliament, but we're going to start putting some action behind the words that say you care. They're supposed to be the caring party. No, they care about themselves. They care about their jobs.
Well, moving on to the news today that the pound has fallen to a 37-year low against the dollar, given the Conservative Party has always been seen by many as the party of the economy. But the Chancellor's tax-cutting mini-budget has sent financial markets into a tailspin, with UK government borrowing costs soaring and the pound slumping to a 37-year low against the dollar. Issuing a punishing verdict on the Chancellor's dash for growth, traders in the City of London sent sterling tumbling amid a broad-based sell-off in response to the massive rise in public borrowing required to finance his plans. The pound fell by almost 2% after Mr Kwarteng announced £45 billion of tax cuts directed at higher earners, trading close to a symbolic $1.10 against the US dollar for the first time since 1985. The FTSE 100 fell more than 2% to trade below 7,000 for the first time since early March, while the cost of borrowing from the UK government on international markets rose by the most in a single day for more than a decade. Borrowing costs on 10-year bonds rose by more than 0.2 percentage points to a trade close to 3.8%, continuing a dramatic climb underway since Liz Truss took over as Prime Minister earlier this month. At the start of September, yields on benchmark UK sovereign debt have risen by almost 1 percentage point, significantly more than for comparable advanced economies. It comes after the Treasury said it would finance the Chancellor's tax cuts and the energy price guarantee for consumers and businesses with £72.4 billion in additional UK government debt sales than planned for the current financial year. Instead of the £161.7 billion planned by the Debt Management Office in April, the Treasury said it would now sell £234.1 billion of government bonds to international investors in 2022-23. The change will mean investors are being approached to buy significantly more government debt than previously expected, and comes in addition to the Bank of Scotland preparing to sell £80 billion worth of gilts held on its balance sheet thanks to its quantitative easing programme. The move comes as the Bank of England responds to soaring inflation by raising interest rates, despite warning that the UK government is already in recession. Those are eye-watering numbers, Linda. It is very difficult, I think, to get your head round what that actually looks like. But it does suggest that we are economically facing a very, very tough time.
Well, yeah. I was hearing today the defence of the pound having fallen so sharply against the dollar as, the dollar's been particularly high, it's been buoyant, the American economy is doing rather well, and yeah, so how come we're not? But anyway, that's not a defence because it's fallen against all the other currencies as well. And that suggests to me that the markets are nervous. And so, the Bank of England, I can see, have said they're putting up interest rates to try and curb inflation. But it would seem that what the UK government is doing has the potential of increasing inflation. So they seem to be pulling in different directions here. That's a worry. That's chaos. Really worrying time. So if the Bank of England has to put up interest rates again, that has a knock-on effect on everything. Mortgages. And it reminds me of the 1980s, what it was like in the 1980s when mortgage interest rates just rocketed. Again, it's all very well for those who are in agreement with what the UK government's doing to say, most people are in fixed-term mortgages and fixed-rate mortgages. And not forever. These things come to an end. And then they're talking about stamp duty as well, having changed the stamp duty to stimulate the housing market. It doesn't work. We've seen that before. We've been here before. And nothing here is new. Nothing here is properly thought out. So not only are you likely to have higher inflation, people with less disposable income, they're going to have to service this debt from somewhere. What's that going to be? Cuts in public services? So that is a huge concern. And it's a huge concern for Scotland. There's already a big hole in the Scottish Government's budget. And the so-called Barnett consequentials and everything else are not going to fill that hole. So, I think we're in really potentially dire straits here. And I just don't know what the answer is. I don't think the UK government's even particularly concerned about finding an answer.
Well, interestingly, Linda, you refer to a tug of war, and in that economic tug of war, a report out today says that the poorest could spend half of their disposable income on energy bills, and the report by the Progressive Economy Forum has said that the UK's poorest households could spend half of that disposable income on gas and electricity this winter, despite the government's energy price guarantee. According to the PAEF, the poorest tenth of families could face bills amounting to 47% of their disposable income this winter, even after Liz Truss's energy price guarantee is taken into account. Average energy bills will be frozen by the government, as we know, at £2,500 for a typical family from October for the next 2 years, in an intervention which was launched by Prime Minister Truss in her first week to shield rich and poor alike from soaring costs. However, the government has faced sharp criticism for failing to provide targeted support for the poorest households, as the cost of living emergency hits those in low incomes harder than for wealthier individuals. According to the PEF, a household in average income is forecast to spend a third of their disposable income on energy bills, almost double the 17% they paid in 2020. But households in the top 10% will be paying only a fifth of their disposable income towards energy costs. Highlighting the risk for the most vulnerable in society, it said the share of income spent by the poorest tenth of families on their energy bills would more than double from 23% in 2020 to 47% this year. The estimates produced using government figures for household consumption include the effects of the blanket energy price guarantee and £400 energy rebate for all households. Talked about eye-watering figures in the last item. Here's one that's all about disparity, where the poorest are seeing the percentage of the little they have coming through the door being spent on keeping themselves warm and secure, whereas for those who are slightly better off, that it's a smaller percentage.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I remember before I was fortunate enough, privileged enough to be elected back in 1999, I worked in housing. It was during a time from the early 80s onwards where there was a lot of rehabilitation of housing going on, because we had bad housing, not only slum landlords, but we had damp council housing and all that. And the aim at that time was that nobody should pay more than 20% of their disposable income on energy costs. And we were absolutely appalled if anyone got up to 30%. That was just the pits. And everyone fought very hard for that, because it was a mark of society moving on, of things getting better, of the way it should be. And it's all been rolled back. And yes, yet again, we've got those who are least able to pay going to have to pay the highest proportion of their income for a basic human right of shelter with warmth. It's just awful.
In further news, I'm going back to an old topic that certainly has continued to rumble in the background, which is Brexit.
Oh.
A Scottish MP has called the UK government's Brexit Freedoms Bill another power grab. Following the publication of the UK government's Brexit Freedoms Bill, the SNP has called the bill another Tory power grab, threatening to undermine devolution, workers' rights, and environmental and food standards. The aim of the retained EU law reform and revocation bill is to repeal all European Union regulations in the UK, including those protecting safe limits on working hours and parental leave, and standards on water quality and baby food too. The UK government wants to do this by the 31st of December 2023, risking vital law that protects many rights and standards disappearing overnight. It also gives the Scottish Government and the Parliament just 1 year to legislate to protect the last 47 years of European Union regulations. The bill will allow UK government ministers to act in policy areas that are devolved without the consent of the Scottish Government, which directly contradicts devolution and the Sewell Convention. Commenting, the SNP's Cabinet Office spokesperson Brendan O'Hara MP said, "Just like the Tories' internal market bill, the Brexit Freedoms Bill is another attempt at a power grab on Scotland and threatens vital protections, yet Liz Truss and her Cabinet are determined to push it through anyway. With the UK government imposing such a reckless deadline, there is a real risk that laws protecting rights and standards, such as holiday pay, parental leave, and the 48-hour work week, as well as good air and water quality, could simply drop off the statute books overnight. It also rides roughshod over the devolution settlement by giving UK ministers the power to act within devolved areas without consent from the Scottish Government. It's a kind of running theme, Linda. We are seeing the erosion of many parts of what we have enjoyed over the 47 years of being part of the European Union, and this would appear to be yet another rolling back of that influence. But it would appear to be one which is quite a difficult one to fathom, given what it touches upon: food safety, environmental health, and so on.
Yeah, these are only the headline grabbers. There'll be lots of other things there, Donald, that are also being eroded. And the biggie is that they will take the power to legislate for Scotland as well. Now, even before I retired, since it was first the talk of the EU referendum about leaving the EU, we were warning about this, and we were poo-pooed all the way, particularly by the Tories in the Scottish Parliament. Don't be ridiculous. That's not going to happen. Well, it's happened already in some things, and it's going to happen in others. And that brings me on to the Labour Party in Scotland, in the Scottish Parliament. They have expressed concern about some elements so far. But workers' rights, surely that's something that the Labour Party should be standing up for. Because the Labour Party actually has a proud history of pushing for and standing up for workers' rights, regardless of some of the erosions that were allowed under New Labour and other things. They did some good stuff even under New Labour and that. But now we have, I see, it's been floated by the UK government. You can tell what's placed by the UK government just to float something. Talking about getting rid of the Working Time Directive. Now, that's massive, because it's 48 hours, I think, at the moment. And so you're talking about things like lorry drivers, their tachometers being shifted so that they can be driving for hours and hours and hours on end. You're talking about people in the health service having to work double shifts. You're talking about folk in 0 hours contracts getting dragged in for double shifts, not necessarily with time and a half for working over certain hours and having to work more than the 48 hours. It's horrendous. And environmental standards, food standards. You know, here we are in Scotland with really good animal welfare stuff. And they say that's devolved, that won't be touched. No, they'll take anything, they'll touch anything. And we should not be allowing it to happen. It's either independence and go our own way on all these things, or it's kicking lumps out of those that are supposed to be standing up for Scotland because they've been elected to the Scottish Parliament to do so, and who are not doing so. So that's the only choices we have. And, well, for me, it's independence every time. Make our own decisions. Well, to me, it's dead simple, dead straightforward.
It's interesting because the Labour Party does not have its problems to seek. Sharon Graham, the leader of Unite, is planning to skip Labour's conference for a second year in a row to prioritise current industrial disputes, and said the party should correct the impression that it's wrong to be in the picket line. Mrs Graham, the General Secretary for just over a year, has presided over 450 disputes over the last 12 months and counted the outcome on pay as a win in 80% of cases. She said strikes are coming to a crescendo at the moment because of the cost of living crisis, when every penny in people's pay packet counts. The Unite leader warned it was a miscalculation by anybody, whether it's Keir Starmer or Liz Truss, quite frankly, in assuming that unions are a hated beast, as workers are voting in increasingly large numbers for strike action. With ongoing strikes at Liverpool docks and elsewhere, Sharon Graham said she was needed in negotiations in the support of striking workers, and so it was very unlikely she will be at Labour conference. Ms Graham met Keir Starmer for detailed discussions last week and has called on Labour to be more robust in defence of workers in disputes for higher pay in Felixstowe, Liverpool and elsewhere. Labour will come under pressure to support inflation-matching pay increases, joining picket lines and renationalisation in a crucial annual conference for Keir Starmer. Linda, have you ever heard the like of a Labour Party leader sacking somebody for joining a picket line? Irrespective of where your politics are, and you alluded to it there, the presumption was always that the working man had a natural place to vote Labour. Is that beginning to be lost?
I don't think it's beginning to be lost. I think it's been getting gradually eroded under the Labour Party for some time. Jeremy Corbyn came in with a very different view, of course. We've all read how he was constantly undermined by those in his own organisation, paid officials, and he ended up not being leader anymore. Keir Starmer, I don't know, I just don't get the man. I mean, I was stunned by when you mentioned that there, at that point where he told Labour MPs they shouldn't be in picket lines. I just never heard the like. My goodness. I have to say, I'll give some credit to the elected Labour members in the Scottish Parliament. They ignored that and said otherwise, and I think some of them did turn up in picket lines. That was absolutely stunning. I think it's also stunning, that they haven't called for proper wage rises for people, Labour. Back to the discussion we had earlier about not being a particularly good opposition. I'm surprised. Well, surprised, maybe I'm not surprised. A bit disheartened at the fact that they're not calling for public ownership, at least, if not full renationalisation. They just don't seem to be the Labour Party anymore. And I don't know Sharon Graham at all, but I wonder if what she's put out is a warning shot across the bows, much stronger than would seem from the press releases and things that went out. I wonder if she's boycotting the conference rather than just saying I can't go. Putting out publicly I can't go because of the ongoing disputes, but it's an actual boycott and there's a big warning being given. I have also a concern. There are particular industries, like I think you mentioned the Liverpool Dockers, for example, who have strong unions. Public services have fairly strong unions as well. There's a heck of a lot of workers out there who are just not represented in any way at all. I would go back to the mention earlier of a particular category of 0 hours contract workers, not some of those like university lecturers and college lecturers who actually, there's only a few of them, want that kind of contract because it suits their working patterns. The people who are working in warehouses, agency workers, people who are working in fast food restaurants and all, they don't have any representation at all. And if the Labour Party can't represent people who are in unions, workers in unions, what the heck are they doing for the workers that are not in unions? Absolutely nothing. Sad, sad, sad.
And the cost of decommissioning the UK's 20th century nuclear waste, and further sad news today, it's believed it could rise to £260 billion as the aged and degrading sites present growing challenges, according to analysis presented to an international group of experts. As the UK government pursues nuclear energy with the promise of a new generation of reactors, the cost of safely cleaning up waste from previous generations of power stations is soaring. Degrading nuclear facilities are presenting increasingly hazardous and challenging problems. Aging equipment and electrical systems at Sellafield, which is storing much of the country's nuclear waste and is one of the most hazardous sites in the world, are increasing the risk of fire, according to the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. They require increasing maintenance and present growing risk. Last October, a faulty light fitting started a blaze at a Sellafield facility, which led to its closure for several weeks. Analysis by Stephen Thomas, a professor of energy policy at the University of Greenwich, estimates the total bill for decommissioning the UK's nuclear waste mountain will grow to £260 billion. Thomas told a conference of international experts the cost of decommissioning Sellafield had risen to £110 billion. The Nuclear Waste Service has said deferring decommissioning for 85 years from shutdown, which was previous policy, is not suitable for all the reactors because of their different ages and physical conditions. Decommissionings of some Magnox stations will have to be brought forward. Attempts to speed up the decommissioning would only add to the growing bill. Part of the soaring increase is the cost of building a large underground nuclear waste dump or geological deposit facility, a GDF, to safely store the 700,000 cubic metres of radioactive waste from the UK's past nuclear programme. The mammoth engineering project was initially predicted to cost £11 billion, but the bill is now estimated to be up to £53 billion because of uncertainty about where the site will be located and the need to provide space for an unspecified amount of waste from the new generation of nuclear reactors, which the UK government wants to build. A decision on where the GDF will be located has yet to be made. Linda, I thought we were moving away from nuclear and we were embracing wind and watertight power.
Well, you know, it's the myth of nuclear energy. Boris Johnson made this big announcement not long before he had to stop being Prime Minister. And he talked about it being cheap. No, it's not cheap at all. There's massive subsidies given to the nuclear industry. Massive subsidies. And then there's the ongoing issues of operations, some of which we've heard about recently, you know, at Sellafield. Potential real problems, real damage. And then there's a long-term decommissioning and storage. It's not cheap. It's sound bites all the way. And again, it's about stuff we've talked about before. You know, looking at shareholders and everything else. Scottish Government, I'm so pleased to say, is against nuclear power in Scotland. Really going for the green energy agenda. Doing great work. I mean, I think as far as the just transition is concerned, there's got to be a bit of rethinking because of the, you know, things that are happening just now. But they're committed. Also, the no fracking, which is huge. They're talking about fracking in England, and they're even talking about changing the levels at which it will be allowed. Big concern, what we talked about earlier, the overriding of Scottish Government decisions through the power grab under this Brexit bill and how that can affect devolution. We've all got to be very vigilant.
The Scottish Government did ban fracking, so
absolutely.
The announcement from the British Government is something that's going to cause a great deal of concern.
Yes, and I just hope everyone in the Scottish Parliament will back the Scottish Government in this, because people feel strongly about it.
And concern is something that Florida prosecutor Ron DeSantis, has been suspended for defying a new 15-week abortion law, is suffering because he says a federal judge's decision to send his reinstatement appeal to trial means a reckoning is coming for the state's Republican governor. Andrew Warren, a Democrat, was removed at Hillsborough County State Attorney on the 4th of August after saying he would not enforce the abortion ban or prosecute providers of gender transition treatment for young people. DeSantis cited Warren's alleged woke agenda in reasons for his decision. At a hearing in Tallahassee on Monday, Judge Robert Hinkle denied motions from DeSantis to dismiss Warren's lawsuit, and another by Warren seeking an immediate return to office, instead requesting their differences be settled at a trial in the coming weeks. It's a victory for the truth, a federal judge has ruled that the governor has to come into court to explain the reasons behind my suspension, said Mr. Warren. The closely watched case is expected to give clarity to DeSantis' power to purge elected officials who disagree with him. In recent weeks, the governor has also removed 4 members of a school board in Broward County that defied him over COVID-19 mask mandates. Warren ran as a progressive when he unseated long-term incumbent Republican Mark Ober as Hillsborough County State Attorney in 2016 and was re-elected with 53% of the vote 4 years later. Now, you alluded to this a little earlier on, Linda, in terms of the Roe versus Wade overturning the Supreme Court's decision, the number of Supreme Court judges who now had an agenda that was closer to the previous president than the current president. And here we have some kickback, somebody who's willing to take a stand, but by taking that stand is finding himself in a bit of a battle.
Yeah, I'm glad there's kickback. I hope there's more kickback. But I think this whole discussion in the US has got a long, long way to go. I think it's going to take a long time to sort itself out. Just one comment I would make is, the comment by, what was it? Who was it said it? DeSantis, he said, there's a woke agenda. Do you know what? I'm getting really fed up with people saying that having a woke agenda or being woke is bad or pejorative. This came out of the civil rights movement in America about race awareness. It's about people's human rights issues. Nothing wrong with being woke. It's like when people here say, oh, that's just politically correct. You're like, really? What is it you want to say? Because do you know what? See what you're having a problem with and you want to say, it'll probably be offensive. It's like, there's nothing wrong with being woke. There's nothing wrong with things being politically correct and being decent. I think there's too much in the US that's not decent just now. And there's too much here that's not decent just now as well. Who are we to talk? But I think it'll run and run. And I would say good luck to Warren in this first fight.
It's an interesting one, I think, because we look across to America. The connection between the United Kingdom and indeed Scotland and America is very, very strong. Yeah. And of course, it used to be that if America sneezed, the UK would catch cold. There's this wave of sort of connection between the two, and it can often be in a philosophical connection as well as a practical connection. So seeing that somebody would actually stand up and say, no, we're not going to enact something that we think is inhumane. Being seen as a woke agenda piece seems to be quite an interesting concept, and hopefully not necessarily, you would imagine, I suppose you would see happening here.
Well, it's already happening here in all sorts of human rights issues, and it'll get worse. Because people only look at human rights issues as being the big things. And that has been helped along by the UK government, all the things they report about, oh, we can't get rid of this terrorist because it's his human rights. They forget that human rights is about how you're treated in a care home. Human rights is about how you're treated at work, how your children are treated at school. It's about every aspect of life. Human rights is a good thing.
Well, that is it for this evening. And before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. So from me, Donald C. Stewart, in the studio, along with my guest tonight, Linda Fabiani, it is bye for now.